The phone shrieked at 3:17 in the morning, jolting me awake on December 26th. Dad's voice cracked through the speaker, raw with panic I had never heard before. "Alton, I need $25,000 right now, or Emma dies." His words tumbled together in desperate sobs. "These people, they have her, and if I don't pay by sunrise, they'll kill her. You're my only hope." When I stayed silent, his tone shifted to the familiar venom. "If you refuse me, you're dead to this family forever." 28 years of being the forgotten son, while Emma got everything flashed through my mind. "Call your golden child," I said coldly and hung up. Sleep came easily after years of conditioning myself to ignore Dad's manipulations. Growing up as Harold Mitchell's second choice had taught me to build walls around my heart. While Emma received new cars for her 16th birthday, I worked double shifts at the local hardware store to buy my own used Honda. When she needed bail money after her third DUI, Dad liquidated his savings without hesitation. When I asked for help with college tuition, he told me real men earned their own way. The morning sun streamed through my apartment windows when my phone buzzed at 8:43. Detective Sarah Martinez introduced herself with the clinical tone police officers use when delivering life-altering news. "Mr. Mitchell, I need to inform you that your father, Harold Mitchell, was found deceased in his residence at approximately 7:15 this morning." My coffee mug slipped from my fingers, ceramic fragments scattering across the hardwood floor like pieces of my suddenly fractured world. "What happened?" "Preliminary examination suggests cardiac arrest. However, we discovered some concerning evidence that requires your immediate attention." Detective Martinez paused, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. "Your sister Emma has been reported missing for 3 weeks. Your father had been in contact with individuals claiming to hold her for ransom." The words hit me like a physical blow. 3 weeks. Dad had been dealing with this nightmare for 3 weeks while I lived my normal life completely unaware. That's impossible. Emma would have called me, or someone would have reached out. "Sir, we found evidence suggesting your father had been attempting to meet ransom demands." The $25,000 mentioned in his final phone call to you was apparently the kidnapper's latest demand. Detective Martinez's voice softened slightly. "We also discovered that you're listed as his emergency contact, not your sister." I sank into my kitchen chair processing this information. Dad had kept me as his emergency contact even after years of our strained relationship. Even after Emma had become his obvious favorite. Even after I'd stopped calling on holidays, because hearing about her latest achievements, while my own accomplishments went unmentioned, became too painful. "We found your business card clutched in his hand," the detective continued, "along with what appears to be a suicide note expressing regret about your last conversation." Guilt crashed over me in waves. While Dad was begging for help to save Emma, I had dismissed him as just another attempt at emotional manipulation. The man who had raised me despite our complicated relationship had died alone in his apartment after I'd hung up on his desperate plea. "Detective, I need to know everything. What evidence do you have about Emma's disappearance?" "Mr. Mitchell, I think it would be better if you came down to the station. There are some things you need to see, and frankly, there may be more to this situation than initially apparent." I arrived at the police station 30 minutes later, my mind racing through every conversation I'd had with Emma over the past month. She'd seemed normal during our brief Christmas dinner together, complaining about her job at the marketing firm and mentioning some new boyfriend she'd been seeing. Nothing had seemed out of the ordinary, but then again, Emma had always been skilled at hiding things from me. Detective Martinez led me to a small conference room where file folders and evidence bags covered a metal table. She was a woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. "Your sister's vehicle was discovered abandoned in the parking lot of the Riverside Casino 3 weeks ago. Her purse was inside, but her phone and wallet were missing." She opened the first folder, revealing crime scene photographs of Emma's blue Toyota Camry. The driver's side door hung open, and I could see her favorite coffee mug still sitting in the cup holder. The casino's security footage shows Emma entering the building at approximately 9:30 p.m. on December 4th, but there's no record of her leaving. Emma doesn't gamble, I said automatically, then caught myself. How much did I really know about my sister's current life? We'd grown distant over the years, our relationship strained by Dad's obvious favoritism, and Emma's seeming indifference to how it affected me. Mr. Mitchell, your father received several phone calls over the past 3 weeks from unknown numbers. We've been able to trace some of these calls, and they all originated from burner phones. The callers claimed to have your sister and demanded increasingly large sums of money. Detective Martinez opened another folder revealing bank statements and financial documents. Your father liquidated his retirement savings, took out a second mortgage on his home, and even sold his car to meet the ransom demands. The total amount he paid out over 3 weeks was nearly $200,000. The room felt like it was spinning. Dad had essentially bankrupted himself trying to save Emma, and I'd been completely oblivious. Why didn't he call me sooner? Why didn't he go to the police immediately? According to the threatening messages, we found the kidnappers specifically warned him against involving law enforcement or other family members. They told him that any deviation from their instructions would result in your sister's death. She pulled out a transcript of a voicemail. They also demonstrated they had intimate knowledge of your family's dynamics, specifically mentioning that you and your father had a strained relationship. I stared at the transcript, recognizing the manipulative precision of someone who had studied our family carefully. They'd known exactly which psychological pressure points to exploit. What happens now? We've issued an Amber Alert for your sister, and we're working with the FBI to trace the ransom payments. However, I need to ask you some difficult questions about your sister's recent behavior and associations. For the next 2 hours, I answered questions about Emma's friends, work colleagues, and dating history. The picture that emerged painted my sister as someone living beyond her means frequently borrowing money from Dad and always seeming to have financial stress despite her decent salary. There's one more thing, Detective Martinez said as our interview concluded. Your father left a voicemail on your phone after you hung up. Would you like to hear it? With trembling hands, I unlocked my phone and played the message I'd ignored in my anger. Dad's broken voice filled the small room. Alton's son, I know I haven't been the father you deserved. I know I favored Emma, and I'm sorry for that. But she's in real trouble, and I'm scared I'm going to lose her. If something happens to me, please don't let her die because of my mistakes. I love you both, and I should have told you that more often. I put my head in my hands as the weight of my father's final words settled over me. He died knowing I'd rejected his desperate plea, and now Emma's life hung in the balance of decisions I'd have to make without him. Detective Martinez arranged for me to access Dad's apartment the following morning to help search for additional evidence. Walking through the front door felt like entering a tomb. Everything remained exactly as he'd left it, from his reading glasses on the coffee table to the half-finished crossword puzzle beside his favorite chair. The apartment reflected Dad's methodical nature, but something felt different. Furniture had been moved slightly and several drawers hung partially open as if he'd been searching frantically for something. On his kitchen counter, I discovered a pile of unpaid bills and past due notices I'd never seen before. Dad had always been meticulous about his finances, but these documents painted a picture of someone drowning in unexpected expenses. He was liquidating everything. Detective Martinez observed, examining bank statements spread across Dad's dining table. Look at this pattern of withdrawals. $5,000 here, $10,000 there, always in cash. I picked up one of the bank statements noting the dates. Each large withdrawal corresponded with a threatening phone call documented in the police report. Dad had been systematically destroying his financial security to meet the kidnappers' demands, never knowing if the next payment would actually bring Emma home. There's something else we need to show you, Detective Martinez said, leading me toward Dad's bedroom. Behind his dresser, she revealed a wall safe I'd never known existed. We found this open when we processed the scene. Your father apparently accessed it recently. Inside the safe, we discovered documents that painted a disturbing picture of Emma's recent activities. Surveillance photographs showed my sister entering and leaving various locations around the city, always in the company of a tall man with dark hair and expensive clothing. The timestamps indicated these photos had been taken over several weeks leading up to her disappearance. Who took these pictures? I asked, examining the professional quality of the surveillance images. That's what we're trying to determine, but look at this. Detective Martinez handed me a manila envelope filled with threatening letters, each one demanding payment for gambling debts Emma had allegedly accumulated. The letters were typed on expensive letterhead bearing the logo of something called Riverside Financial Solutions. Each communication grew progressively more threatening, describing in graphic detail what would happen to Emma if the debts weren't paid promptly. The amounts mentioned were staggering $15,000, then $30,000, eventually climbing to over $100,000. Emma doesn't gamble, I repeated, but my voice lacked conviction. How many times had I said that about various aspects of my sister's life, only to discover I'd been wrong? Mr. Mitchell, there's something else. Detective Martinez opened another evidence bag, revealing a stack of loan documents. These papers show that your sister used your father as a co-signer for several high-interest loans. The collateral listed includes his home, his car, and his veteran's pension benefits. I stared at the signatures, recognizing Dad's careful handwriting alongside what appeared to be Emma's more flowing script. But something looked wrong about Dad's signatures. They seemed shaky and inconsistent compared to his usual precise penmanship. I don't think Dad signed these willingly, I said, comparing the signatures to other documents in the safe. Look at how different they are from his normal writing. Detective Martinez examined the documents more closely. You may be right. We'll have a forensic handwriting expert analyze these. If your sister forged your father's signature on loan documents, that's fraud on top of everything else? We continued searching through Dad's belongings, each discovery painting a darker picture of Emma's secret life. Hidden beneath his mattress, we found credit card statements showing charges to high-end restaurants, expensive clothing stores, and multiple cash advances. All the cards were in Dad's name, but the spending patterns clearly didn't match his modest lifestyle. She was bleeding him dry, I said, feeling sick as the scope of Emma's financial abuse became clear. Dad lived on Social Security and his military pension. He couldn't afford any of this. In Dad's closet, Detective Martinez discovered a shoebox containing more evidence of the psychological torture he'd endured. Voice recordings on a small digital device captured the kidnappers making their demands, but also revealed Emma's voice in the background, crying and pleading for Dad to save her. Listening to those recordings broke something inside me. Emma's terror sounded genuine, but the sophistication of the kidnapping operation suggested careful planning and inside knowledge of our family dynamics. Someone had studied us thoroughly before executing this scheme. There's one more thing you need to see, Detective Martinez said, handing me a business card found in Dad's wallet. Vincent Russo Debt Recovery Specialist. I'd never heard the name before, but something about it sent a chill down my spine. The card was expensive looking with embossed lettering and a subtle watermark. This wasn't some back alley loan shark operation. This was something more sophisticated and dangerous. We ran Russo through our database. He's known to us as a violent debt collector with connections to organized gambling operations. If your sister owed money to people in Russo's network, she would have been in serious danger. Detective Martinez's phone rang, and she stepped away to take the call. I remained in Dad's bedroom, surrounded by evidence of my sister's deception and my father's desperate attempts to save her. The man I'd resented for years had been protecting me from this ugliness, never letting me know how far Emma had fallen into financial predation. When Detective Martinez returned, her expression had grown more serious. That was the FBI. They've been tracking financial crimes connected to Russo's operation, and your sister's case fits a pattern they've been investigating. They want to meet with us this afternoon. What kind of pattern? Wealthy individuals with gambling problems being systematically exploited for their assets, then used as leverage against their families. Your sister may not just be a victim, Mr. Mitchell. She may have been specifically targeted because of your father's veteran benefits and property assets. As we prepared to leave Dad's apartment, I took one last look around the place where he'd spent his final weeks in agony. Every object seemed to tell a story of his sacrifice and Emma's betrayal. The man who'd raised us both had died alone, and afraid, not knowing if his efforts to save Emma would succeed or if he'd ever see either of his children again. Detective, I need to ask you something. Do you think Emma is still alive? She paused at the front door, considering her words carefully. The fact that the kidnappers continued demanding money until the very end suggests they still had her. But now that your father is gone, their leverage has changed. We need to find her quickly before they decide she's no longer useful to them. Walking out of Dad's apartment, I realized my life had been completely transformed in less than 48 hours. The man I thought I understood had been living a nightmare I couldn't have imagined. And the sister I'd thought I knew had apparently been living a double life that had destroyed our family's financial security and ultimately killed our father. The investigation was just beginning, but I already knew that whatever we discovered would change everything I thought I knew about my family forever. FBI agent Daniel Rivers met us at the Federal Building downtown that afternoon. He was a lean man in his 50s with prematurely gray hair and the kind of intense focus that suggested he'd seen too many cases like ours. His office walls displayed commendations for work in financial crimes and human trafficking, giving me some confidence that Emma might be in capable hands. Mr. Mitchell, I need to prepare you for what you're about to see, Agent Rivers said, settling behind his desk with a thick file folder. Your sister's case intersects with a major investigation we've been conducting into gambling-related kidnapping schemes targeting middle-class families. He opened the folder and spread out a series of photographs showing other victims, all young women from comfortable backgrounds who disappeared after accumulating large gambling debts. The pattern is always the same. Women with access to family money develop gambling addictions, get in over their heads with professional debt collectors, then disappear when they can't pay. What happens to them? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Usually they're held until their families exhaust their assets paying ransom demands. After that, Agent Rivers didn't finish the sentence, but his expression told me everything I needed to know. Detective Martinez leaned forward. Agent Rivers, we found evidence that Emma had been forging her father's signature on loan documents. Could this have been part of a larger scheme? Absolutely. We believe these operations specifically recruit women who have access to elderly family members with significant assets. The gambling addiction is often genuine, but it's also exploited by criminal organizations who see an opportunity for long-term financial extraction. Agent Rivers pulled out a laptop and turned it toward me. 3 hours ago, we received this video file at an email address associated with your father's case. I need to warn you that the content is disturbing, but it may provide crucial evidence about your sister's location and condition. The video began with Emma sitting in what appeared to be a concrete basement, her hands bound behind a metal chair. She looked thinner than I remembered her usually perfect hair hanging in greasy strands around her face. A voice from behind the camera demanded she read from a script. Alton. Emma began, her voice shaking with what appeared to be genuine terror. These people are going to kill me if you don't pay them $50,000 by midnight tonight. Dad is gone, and you're my only hope now. Please, I know we've had our differences, but I'm your sister. I don't want to die in this place. I watched my sister break down in tears, and despite everything I'd learned about her deception, my heart ached seeing her in such obvious distress. But then something in the video caught my attention. Can you replay that section? I asked Agent Rivers, pointing to a moment when Emma had looked directly at the camera. As he rewound the video, I noticed Emma's eyes weren't focused on the camera lens. Instead, she appeared to be looking slightly to the left, as if communicating with someone outside the frame. Her facial expression had also changed subtly, showing less fear and more calculation. "There, stop it, right there," I said. In the freeze frame, Emma's mouth was slightly open as if she was about to speak, but her eyes held a look I recognized from our childhood. It was the same expression she'd worn when lying to our parents about breaking something or getting in trouble at school. "Something's wrong with this video, Mai," I told Agent Rivers. "Emma's acting." Agent Rivers studied the frozen image more carefully. "What makes you think that—" "I've known Emma for 28 years. This is how she looks when she's manipulating someone. She's putting on a performance." Agent Rivers played the video several more times, analyzing Emma's body language and vocal patterns. "You know, now that you mention it, there are some inconsistencies in her distress responses. Most kidnapping victims show very specific psychological patterns under extreme stress. Your sister's reactions seem almost rehearsed." Detective Martinez examined the technical aspects of the video. "The quality is very high for something recorded by kidnappers. Most criminal operations use cheap equipment, but this looks almost professional." "There's something else," I said, noticing details in the background. "That basement doesn't look improvised. See how clean the walls are? And that's expensive lighting equipment partially visible in the corner." As we analyzed the video frame by frame, more inconsistencies emerged. Emma's restraints appeared loose enough that she could have easily freed herself. The concrete walls showed no signs of dampness or deterioration, typical of abandoned buildings used by kidnappers. Most telling, there were no visible security measures, like locks or barriers, that would prevent escape. "Agent Rivers, I think my sister staged this video herself," I said, voicing the terrible suspicion growing in my mind. "I think she's working with these people." "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Mitchell. What would her motivation be?" I thought about everything we discovered in Dad's apartment: the forged loan documents, the systematic financial abuse, the photographs taken before her supposed kidnapping. Money. Emma has been stealing from Dad for months, maybe years. She forged his signature on loans, maxed out credit cards in his name, and essentially destroyed his financial security. Agent Rivers made notes as I continued. But Dad was getting suspicious. Or maybe the debt collectors were pressuring her for larger amounts than she could steal gradually. So she stages her own kidnapping to extract one large lump sum that would pay off her debts and give her enough money to disappear. "But the kidnapping has gone on for 3 weeks, Detective Martinez pointed out. "Why would she drag it out so long?" "Because Dad didn't have that kind of money readily available. She needed time for him to liquidate his assets." The full scope of Emma's cruelty became clear to me. She was willing to torture our father psychologically for weeks, to squeeze every dollar out of him before he died. Agent Rivers closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair. "If your theory is correct, your sister isn't just a fraud victim. She's a co-conspirator in a scheme that ultimately killed her own father." The weight of this realization settled over me like a physical burden. Emma hadn't just betrayed Dad financially. She'd emotionally tortured him for weeks, while he desperately tried to save her life. Every sleepless night he'd spent wondering if she was safe, every dollar he'd sacrificed trying to meet ransom demands, every moment of agony he'd endured had been orchestrated by his own daughter. "What do we do now?" I asked. "We set a trap," Agent Rivers said. "If Emma is working with these criminals, she'll expect you to respond to this ransom demand just like your father did. We'll arrange a meeting, wire you with surveillance equipment, and see who shows up." Detective Martinez looked concerned. "That puts Mr. Mitchell in considerable danger. If these people realize they're being set up, they could become violent." "I'll do it," I said without hesitation. Dad died thinking he'd failed to save Emma. If she's responsible for his death, I need to make sure she faces justice. Agent Rivers outlined the plan. I would respond to the ransom demand, agree to meet the kidnappers, at a location of their choosing and deliver marked bills, while FBI agents monitored the exchange. The goal was to identify all members of the criminal organization and gather evidence of Emma's involvement. "There's one more thing you should know," Agent Rivers said as our meeting concluded. "We believe this operation has been targeting military families specifically because veteran benefits and disability payments provide steady income streams that are difficult to trace or freeze. Your father's military service made him an ideal victim." Walking out of the FBI building, I felt like I was living in a nightmare where everything I thought I knew about my family had been revealed as a lie. Emma wasn't the golden child who'd simply made some poor financial decisions. She was a calculating criminal who'd systematically exploited Dad's love for her until it literally killed him. But despite everything, a small part of me still hoped I was wrong. Maybe Emma really was a victim who'd gotten in over her head with dangerous people. Maybe the inconsistencies in the video could be explained by stress or fear. Maybe my sister hadn't intentionally caused our father's death. That hope would be completely shattered in the next phase of our investigation. Agent Rivers contacted me the next morning with details for the ransom exchange. I was to meet Emma's alleged kidnappers at 9 p.m. in the parking lot of an abandoned shopping mall on the outskirts of town. The location choice struck me as odd because it was far from the urban areas where most criminal operations typically functioned. "The mall has been closed for 3 years," Agent Rivers explained as FBI technicians fitted me with a concealed recording device and GPS tracker. "It provides multiple escape routes for the criminals, but also gives us good vantage points for surveillance. Our team will be positioned throughout the area before you arrive." The recording equipment was smaller than I'd expected, barely larger than a shirt button, and designed to be undetectable even during a physical search. The GPS tracker was sewn into the lining of my jacket, and I carried a briefcase containing $50,000 in marked bills provided by the FBI. "Remember, your primary objective is gathering intelligence, not heroics," Agent Rivers cautioned. "If the situation becomes dangerous, we'll move in immediately. Don't try to confront anyone or deviate from the plan." Detective Martinez rode with me to a staging area 2 miles from the mall. During the drive, she reviewed the safety protocols and emergency signals we'd discussed. Despite the FBI's thorough preparation, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something crucial about Emma's situation. "Mr. Mitchell, can I ask you something personal?" Detective Martinez said as we waited for the final go-ahead from the surveillance team. "Of course." "Do you think your sister is capable of murder? Because if she orchestrated your father's death through psychological torture, that's exactly what we're dealing with." I considered the question carefully. The Emma I'd grown up with had always been manipulative and selfish, but I'd attributed those traits to Dad's favoritism rather than genuine malice. 2 days ago, I would have said absolutely not. But now, I honestly don't know what she's capable of. Agent Rivers' voice crackled through my earpiece. "All units in position. Subject vehicle approaching target location. Mitchell, you're cleared to proceed." I drove into the mall's main parking lot at exactly 9 p.m. The abandoned shopping center looked like a monument to economic decay, with broken windows and graffiti covering most of the storefronts. Security lighting had long since failed, leaving the area in shadows broken only by my headlights. A black SUV sat near the mall's main entrance, its engine running and windows tinted dark enough to conceal the occupants. As I approached with the briefcase, the driver's door opened and a man stepped out. He was tall and well-dressed, exactly matching the description from the surveillance photos found in Dad's safe. "You must be Alton," the man said, his voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't place. "I'm Vincent Russo. I believe you have something for me." "Where's my sister?" I demanded, following the script Agent Rivers had provided. "Safe for now. But that depends on whether you've brought the full amount we discussed." Russo gestured toward the briefcase. $50,000, correct? I set the briefcase on the ground between us, noting how calm and professional Russo appeared. This wasn't the behavior of a desperate criminal operation. It felt more like a business transaction. I want proof that Emma is still alive, I said. Russo smiled and pulled out his phone, playing a brief video clip showing Emma in what appeared to be the same basement from the ransom video. She looked directly at the camera and said, "Alton, it's Tuesday night. Please just give them the money so I can come home." But something in her delivery bothered me. Emma's voice lacked the terror I'd heard in the previous video. Instead, she sounded almost bored, like she was reading lines from a script she'd rehearsed multiple times. "Where are you holding her?" I asked, deviating slightly from the FBI's script. "That's not your concern," Russo replied. "Your only job is to provide the money and walk away, just like your father should have done." "What do you mean by that?" Russo's expression hardened. Harold was a stubborn old man who asked too many questions. He started getting suspicious about the operation and threatened to go to the police. That kind of behavior is bad for business. I felt my anger rising, but Agent Rivers' voice in my earpiece reminded me to stay calm and gather information. "So you killed him?" I didn't have to. The stress of thinking his daughter was in danger took care of that problem for me. Russo opened the briefcase and examined the money inside. Harold died believing he'd failed to save Emma. That's a much more poetic ending than anything I could have arranged. The casual cruelty in Russo's voice made me want to attack him physically, but I forced myself to continue the conversation. "What happens to Emma after you get the money?" "That depends on how cooperative she continues to be." Russo closed the briefcase and signaled to someone in the SUV. "Your sister has been very helpful in identifying other potential targets. Military families are surprisingly easy to exploit once you understand their psychological vulnerabilities." A second person emerged from the SUV, and I was shocked to recognize Dr. Patricia Wells, a woman I'd seen at some of Dad's veteran affairs appointments. She was a therapist who supposedly specialized in helping military families deal with financial stress. "Hello, Alton," Dr. Wells said warmly, as if we were meeting at a social gathering rather than a criminal ransom exchange. "I'm sorry for your loss. Your father was a good man who loved his children very much." "You knew my father?" I asked, confused by her presence. "Dr. Wells has been very helpful in identifying suitable candidates for our operation," Russo explained. "Military veterans often struggle with trust issues and family relationships. A sympathetic therapist can gather a lot of useful information during counseling sessions." The scope of the conspiracy began to dawn on me. This wasn't just a random kidnapping scheme. It was a sophisticated operation that had been targeting military families systematically. Dr. Wells had been using her position as a therapist to identify victims and gather intelligence about their finances and family dynamics. "How many families have you destroyed?" I asked. "We prefer to think of it as providing a service," Dr. Wells replied. "These families often have dysfunctional relationships and unrealistic financial expectations. We simply help them restructure their priorities." Agent Rivers' voice buzzed in my earpiece. "We've got enough evidence. Get ready to move away from the vehicle." But before I could step back, a third figure emerged from the shadows near the mall entrance. Emma walked toward us wearing clean clothes and moving with none of the weakness or fear I'd expected from someone held captive for weeks. "Hello, brother," Emma said casually. "Thanks for bringing the money. This whole thing has taken way longer than we originally planned." I stared at my sister in shock, finally understanding the full extent of her betrayal. "You've been working with them all along." "Of course I have," Emma replied, her voice lacking any trace of remorse. "Did you really think I was some helpless victim? I've been planning this for months." "But the gambling debts, the loan sharks, the threats," Emma laughed coldly. "All part of the setup. We needed a believable story to explain why Dad was being pressured for money. The gambling addiction was real enough, but Vincent and Patricia helped me turn it into something profitable." "You killed our father," I said, my voice barely controlled. "Dad killed himself by being too stubborn to simply pay what we asked for," Emma replied. If he'd just given us the money immediately instead of dragging it out for weeks, he'd still be alive. Agent Rivers' voice crackled urgently in my earpiece. Units moving in now. Get down. FBI agents emerged from concealment points around the parking lot surrounding our group with tactical precision. Russo reached for a weapon, but Agent Rivers' team was already on top of him. Dr. Wells attempted to flee toward the mall entrance, but was quickly apprehended. Emma, however, made no attempt to escape. Instead, she calmly watched the chaos around her as if she'd been expecting this outcome. Emma Mitchell, you're under arrest for conspiracy fraud, elder abuse, and felony murder. Agent Rivers announced as he approached with handcuffs. I want a lawyer, Emma said, simply showing no emotion as she was restrained. As the FBI loaded the suspects into transport vehicles, Agent Rivers pulled me aside. Mr. Mitchell, we found something else during our investigation into Dr. Wells's practice. There may be additional charges related to your mother's death several years ago. What do you mean? We'll discuss it in detail tomorrow, but preliminary evidence suggests your mother's accidental medication overdose may not have been accidental. Dr. Wells kept extensive notes about her patient's family dynamics, and some of those notes mention Emma expressing resentment about inheritance issues. I watched my sister being driven away in the back of an FBI vehicle, finally understanding that the person I'd grown up with had been systematically destroying our family for years. Emma hadn't just betrayed Dad. She'd apparently murdered our mother, and then used Dad's grief and guilt to manipulate him for financial gain. The Golden Child had been a monster all along, and Dad had died never knowing the truth about either of his children. The FBI raid had been a complete success from a law enforcement perspective, but personally it left me feeling hollowed out and confused. Agent Rivers debriefed me at the federal building the next morning, walking me through evidence that painted an even darker picture of Emma's criminal activities. Your sister has been very cooperative since her arrest. Agent Rivers began opening a thick file folder. She's provided detailed information about the entire operation in exchange for plea negotiations. What kind of information? Emma's involvement with this criminal organization goes back almost 2 years. She initially contacted Dr. Wells seeking legitimate gambling addiction counseling, but Dr. Wells recognized an opportunity when Emma mentioned your father's military benefits and property assets. Agent Rivers spread out financial documents showing the sophisticated nature of the scheme. Emma had been systematically stealing small amounts from Dad's accounts for months before escalating to forged loan documents and credit card fraud. The gambling debts had been real, but they'd also been strategically managed to create leverage for the kidnapping plot. The most disturbing aspect is how calculating your sister's planning was, Agent Rivers continued. She provided Dr. Wells with detailed psychological profiles of your father, identifying exactly which emotional triggers would be most effective in extracting money. I studied the documents, recognizing Emma's handwriting in margins, where she'd made notes about Dad's military service trauma and his guilt about spending more attention on her than on me. She'd weaponized our family's emotional dynamics against Dad with scientific precision. What about Vincent Russo? How does he fit into this? Russo runs a legitimate debt collection agency that occasionally partners with criminal organizations for high-value targets. Dr. Wells would identify suitable victims through her therapy practice, Emma would create the financial leverage through theft and fraud, and Russo would execute the kidnapping and ransom scheme. Detective Martinez joined our meeting with additional evidence from the crime scene analysis. We processed the location where Emma claimed to be held captive. It's actually a basement studio apartment that Russo rents for staging kidnapping videos. We found equipment for professional video production and multiple sets designed to look like different types of criminal hideouts. So Emma was never actually in danger. Not from external threats, Detective Martinez replied. But the partnership with Russo and Dr. Wells was more complicated than we initially understood. Emma thought she was controlling the situation, but Russo had been planning to eliminate her once the operation concluded. Agent Rivers opened another file containing recorded conversations between the conspirators. We intercepted communication suggesting that Russo viewed Emma as a liability once your father's money was exhausted. She would have been murdered to prevent her from testifying against the organization. I listened to excerpts from the recorded conversations, hearing Emma's voice gradually shift from confident manipulation to nervous uncertainty as she realized Russo wasn't treating her as an equal partner. In the final recordings, she sounded genuinely frightened for the first time during the entire operation. Emma may be a sociopath, but she's not stupid, Agent Rivers observed. When she understood that Russo intended to kill her, she began documenting evidence against him as insurance. That's part of why she's been so cooperative since her arrest. What kind of evidence? Detective Martinez produced a laptop computer recovered from Emma's apartment. Financial records, communications with other victims' families, detailed plans for future operations, targeting military veterans. Emma kept meticulous records of everything, probably as leverage against her partners. Scrolling through Emma's files felt like reading the diary of a stranger. The sister I'd grown up with had been living a completely separate life as a professional criminal targeting vulnerable families with the same casual indifference she'd once shown toward my childhood feelings. There's something else you need to know, Agent Rivers said carefully. Emma's cooperation has led us to evidence about your mother's death 5 years ago. My blood went cold. I'd always believed Mom had died from an accidental medication overdose related to her chronic pain management. The doctors had explained that mixing her prescriptions with alcohol could be fatal, and we'd assumed she'd simply made a tragic mistake. Dr. Wells was your mother's pain management counselor at the time, Detective Martinez explained. Emma had been expressing resentment about inheritance issues, particularly the fact that your mother's will left everything to your father rather than directly to you and Emma. Agent Rivers opened a final folder containing medical records and therapy notes. Dr. Wells documented multiple conversations where Emma discussed ways to accelerate your mother's declining health. The night your mother died, Emma was the last person to see her alive. I stared at the therapy notes written in Dr. Wells' careful handwriting. Emma had apparently spent months researching drug interactions and discussing how to make a murder look like an accidental overdose. She'd even practiced mixing medications during visits to Mom's house. You're telling me Emma murdered our mother? The evidence strongly suggests it, Agent Rivers replied. Emma provided your mother with alcohol and additional pain medications that night, knowing the combination would be fatal. She then waited until your mother was unconscious before calling 911, ensuring the delay would prevent successful medical intervention. The full scope of Emma's evil finally crystallized in my mind. She'd murdered our mother for inheritance money, then spent years systematically stealing from Dad while emotionally manipulating him. When theft wasn't enough, she'd staged her own kidnapping to extract his remaining assets, ultimately causing his death through psychological torture. How many people has she killed? We're still investigating, but Emma's cooperation has revealed at least 3 other suspicious deaths among Dr. Wells's patient families. All involved elderly military veterans who died under circumstances that initially appeared natural or accidental. Detective Martinez showed me photographs of the other victims, an elderly Navy veteran who'd supposedly fallen downstairs after his daughter convinced him to change his will, an Army retiree who died from a heart attack after his son accumulated massive gambling debts, and an Air Force widow who'd been found dead from carbon monoxide poisoning after her grandson moved in to help with household management. This has been going on for years, I realized. Emma wasn't just stealing from our family. She was part of an operation that's been murdering military veterans across the region. That's correct, Agent Rivers confirmed. Dr. Wells used her position as a veteran affairs counselor to identify targets, then recruited family members who had financial problems or addiction issues. Emma was one of their most successful operators because she was intelligent enough to plan long-term schemes and ruthless enough to carry them through to completion. I thought about all the times over the years when Emma had visited Dad supposedly out of family affection. She'd actually been monitoring his financial situation and psychological state, gathering intelligence for her criminal partners while slowly poisoning his trust in me to ensure I wouldn't interfere with her schemes. What happens now? Emma will be charged with multiple counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy, fraud, and elder abuse. Given the evidence we've gathered and her cooperation with our investigation, she's looking at life in prison without the possibility of parole. Agent Rivers closed the files and leaned back in his chair. Mr. Mitchell, I need to ask you one more question. Looking back at your family's history, were there any other suspicious incidents or unexplained deaths that might be connected to this operation? I searched my memory for anything that had seemed unusual over the years. Dad's occasional comments about feeling unusually tired after Emma's visits, Mom's sudden deterioration in the weeks before her death, various elderly neighbors and family friends who died under circumstances that had seemed unfortunate but not necessarily suspicious. There might be others, I admitted. Emma had access to a lot of elderly people through Dad's veteran community. If she was working with Dr. Wells to identify vulnerable targets, there could be victims we haven't discovered yet. That's what we're afraid of, Detective Martinez replied. This investigation is going to expand significantly as we examine all the deaths connected to Dr. Wells's patient database. Walking out of the FBI building, I realized that my family's destruction had been just one small part of a much larger criminal enterprise. Emma hadn't simply betrayed Dad and me. She'd been systematically murdering elderly veterans for their assets while hiding behind the facade of being a loving daughter. The golden child had been a serial killer, and I was the only member of my family left alive to ensure justice was served for all her victims. 6 months later, I sat in the federal courthouse watching Emma's trial unfold with a mixture of grief and grim satisfaction. She'd been charged with 7 counts of first-degree murder, including Mom and Dad, along with conspiracy fraud and elder abuse spanning multiple years. The prosecution had built an overwhelming case using Emma's own meticulous records and Dr. Wells's detailed therapy notes. Emma looked different in court. Gone was the confident, manipulative woman who'd orchestrated our family's destruction. Sitting at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit, she appeared smaller and more fragile, though I knew her apparent vulnerability was just another performance designed to gain sympathy from the jury. Prosecutor Amanda Rodriguez had spent the morning outlining the scope of Emma's crimes for the 12 jurors. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about a woman who systematically murdered members of her own family and other vulnerable elderly victims for financial gain. The evidence will show that Emma Mitchell is not a troubled daughter who made poor decisions, but a calculating serial killer who used familial trust as a weapon. The first witness was Dr. Patricia Wells, who'd agreed to testify against Emma in exchange for a reduced sentence. Wells looked nervous and defeated as she explained how the criminal operation had functioned. Emma approached me initially as a legitimate patient seeking help for gambling addiction, Dr. Wells testified. But during our early sessions, she began asking detailed questions about inheritance law and medication interactions. It became clear she was more interested in learning how to exploit elderly family members than in addressing her addiction. Prosecutor Rodriguez displayed therapy notes on a large screen for the jury. Dr. Wells, can you explain what Emma meant when she wrote about accelerating the natural process regarding her mother's health? Emma was researching ways to cause her mother's death without arousing suspicion. She specifically asked about drug interactions that could be fatal but would appear accidental during autopsy. I watched Emma's face as Dr. Wells described her cold-blooded planning. Emma showed no emotion, staring straight ahead, as if the testimony was about someone else entirely. The prosecutor continued building her case with financial evidence showing how Emma had systematically stolen from Dad over 2 years. Bank records, forged documents, and credit card statements painted a picture of methodical financial abuse that had destroyed Dad's retirement security. Agent Rivers testified about the FBI investigation and Emma's eventual cooperation. Ms. Mitchell provided detailed information about the entire criminal operation, including murders we hadn't previously connected to the conspiracy. However, her cooperation appeared motivated primarily by self-preservation rather than genuine remorse. Can you explain what you mean by that? Ms. Mitchell only began cooperating when she realized her criminal partners intended to eliminate her as a witness. Her assistance to law enforcement was calculated to improve her own legal situation rather than to provide justice for victims. The most damaging testimony came from Vincent Russo, who'd agreed to testify against Emma to avoid the death penalty for his own crimes. Russo described Emma's role in the conspiracy with clinical detail. Emma was our most effective recruiter because she understood family psychology, Russo explained. She could identify exactly which emotional triggers would extract the maximum amount of money from elderly parents. Her own father was essentially a test case for techniques she later used against other families. Did Ms. Mitchell express any remorse about her father's death? She said Harold was weak and deserved what happened to him. Emma felt that elderly people were essentially useless and their money was being wasted on medical care and comfortable living. She saw herself as simply redistributing assets to more productive purposes. I had to leave the courtroom during that testimony, unable to listen to Emma's callous attitude about Dad's death. In the hallway, I encountered several family members of other victims, people whose loved ones had died because of Emma's manipulation and greed. Margaret Peterson's granddaughter had died after being recruited into the conspiracy to steal from Margaret's military pension. James Sullivan's son had murdered him for insurance money after being coached by Emma on how to stage an accidental death. Each family had trusted someone they loved, never realizing they were being systematically exploited by professional criminals. When I returned to the courtroom, Emma's defense attorney was presenting her closing argument. He painted Emma as a victim of manipulation by older, more experienced criminals who'd exploited her gambling addiction and mental health issues. Ladies and gentlemen, Emma Mitchell is certainly guilty of poor judgment and financial crimes, but she is not the mastermind of this operation. She was a young woman struggling with addiction who was recruited and manipulated by sophisticated criminals who saw her vulnerability as an opportunity. The defense strategy focused on Emma's supposed mental health issues and portrayed her cooperation with law enforcement as evidence of genuine remorse. But prosecutor Rodriguez's rebuttal systematically demolished these arguments with Emma's own words and actions. The defendant wants you to believe she was a victim, but the evidence shows she was an enthusiastic participant who murdered her own mother and systematically tortured her father to death for money. Her cooperation with law enforcement only began when she realized her criminal partners intended to kill her. That's not remorse, that's self-preservation. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Emma showed no reaction as the judge read each guilty verdict, maintaining the same emotionless expression she'd worn throughout the trial. During the sentencing phase, I was allowed to present a victim impact statement describing how Emma's crimes had destroyed our family and affected the broader community of military veterans who'd been targeted by the conspiracy. Emma didn't just murder our parents, I told the court. She systematically destroyed the trust that military families place in their children and community support systems. Every veteran who heard about this case now has to wonder if their own children might be capable of similar betrayal. I looked directly at Emma as I continued. Our father died believing he'd failed to save his daughter, never knowing that his daughter was actually the one destroying him. That level of psychological cruelty goes beyond simple greed. It represents a complete absence of human empathy. The judge sentenced Emma to life in prison without the possibility of parole on each murder count to be served consecutively. She also received additional decades for fraud conspiracy and elder abuse. Even if legal appeals succeeded in overturning some convictions, Emma would never again be free to hurt anyone. As court officers led Emma away to begin her life sentence, she finally looked at me directly for the first time since her arrest. Her expression held no remorse, no recognition of the pain she'd caused, no acknowledgement of our shared family history. She looked at me with the same cold indifference she might show a stranger, confirming that the sister I'd grown up with had never really existed. Dr. Wells received 25 years for her role in the conspiracy. Vincent Russo was sentenced to death for his leadership of the criminal organization. Several other conspirators received various prison terms based on their level of involvement in the murders and fraud schemes. The trial's conclusion brought justice for Emma's victims, but it couldn't restore the family she'd destroyed or bring back the people who died trusting someone they loved. Dad would never know that his love for Emma hadn't been wasted on an innocent daughter in trouble, but rather manipulated by a calculating killer who viewed his affection as a weakness to be exploited. Walking out of the courthouse after Emma's sentencing, I realized that justice had been served, but my real work was just beginning. There were other families affected by this conspiracy who needed support, and there were systematic changes needed to protect military veterans from similar exploitation in the future. Emma's evil had revealed the need for better safeguards and support systems, and I was determined to ensure that Dad's death would ultimately lead to protection for other families facing similar threats. 1 year after Emma's conviction, I stood in the conference room of the Harold Mitchell Memorial Foundation, surrounded by financial advisors, social workers, and veteran advocates who'd helped transform my grief into meaningful action. The foundation had grown from my initial desire to honor Dad's memory into a comprehensive program serving military families across 3 states. We've assisted over 400 families in the past 12 months, announced Sarah Chen, our program director, and a former Army financial counselor. Our debt intervention services have prevented an estimated $12 million in fraudulent financial exploitation targeting military families. The foundation operated on multiple levels, providing financial literacy, education, debt counseling, and fraud protection specifically designed for military veterans and their families. We'd also lobbied successfully for legislation requiring enhanced background checks for financial counselors working with veteran affairs programs. Detective Martinez, who'd become both a close friend and the foundation's law enforcement liaison, presented statistics showing the broader impact of Emma's trial. The investigation into Dr. Wells's patient network ultimately identified 37 suspicious deaths and prevented an estimated 53 additional planned murders. Emma's cooperation, whatever her motives, saved countless lives. I often reflected on the strange irony that Emma's evil had ultimately protected more people than her continued freedom ever could have. Her detailed records and testimony had exposed a network of criminal exploitation that might have continued for years without detection. The foundation's headquarters occupied Dad's former house, which I'd renovated to serve as both memorial and practical resource center. His military medals and photographs were displayed prominently in the main lobby, along with pictures of other veterans who'd been victimized by financial predators targeting military families. "Alton, we have someone here who wants to meet you," Sarah announced, leading an elderly man into the conference room. "This is Charles Patterson, retired Marine Corps sergeant. He believes his daughter might have been involved in a scheme similar to Emma's." Charles Patterson was a dignified man in his 70s, with the bearing of someone who'd spent decades in military service. He shook my hand with the firm grip of someone still strong despite his age. "Mr. Mitchell, my daughter Linda, has been pressuring me to take out loans against my house and change my will to give her immediate access to my assets. After reading about your sister's case in the newspaper, I'm concerned she might be involved with criminals who target military families." I spent an hour with Mr. Patterson listening to his concerns and helping him understand the warning signs of financial exploitation. His situation bore uncomfortable similarities to what Emma had done to Dad: gradual isolation from other family members, pressure to make quick financial decisions, and threats to cut off family contact if he didn't comply with her demands. The most important thing is that you recognized the pattern and sought help, I told him. My father didn't have that opportunity because he didn't know such schemes existed, but you can protect yourself and potentially save your daughter if she's been recruited by criminals rather than initiating the scheme herself. We connected Mr. Patterson with both legal assistance and law enforcement resources to investigate his daughter's activities. Within 2 weeks, police had identified her involvement with a criminal organization similar to Dr. Wells's network, and intervention prevented both Mr. Patterson's victimization and his daughter's progression from fraud to murder. Cases like Mr. Patterson's demonstrated the Foundation's most important function: breaking the cycle of exploitation before it could escalate to violence. Emma's story had become a cautionary tale that helped other families recognize dangerous situations and seek help before irreparable damage occurred. Detective Martinez often brought me updates about other families affected by Emma's crimes. The children of her elderly victims had formed their own support network, helping each other process the betrayal of learning their parents had been murdered by trusted family members. It's strange how Emma's evil created connections between people who might never have met otherwise, Detective Martinez observed. These families found strength in sharing their experiences and supporting each other through the legal process. The Foundation also worked with military chaplains and family counselors to address the psychological impact of financial exploitation within military communities. Many veterans struggled with trust issues after learning about cases like Emma's becoming suspicious of their own children and grandchildren, even when those suspicions were unfounded. The goal is balance, explained Dr. Robert Hayes, a psychologist who joined our advisory board. We want veterans to be appropriately cautious about financial exploitation without becoming so paranoid that they destroy legitimate family relationships. 6 months after the Foundation's first anniversary, I received an unexpected visitor. Agent Rivers stopped by during one of our community education seminars, bringing news about Emma's situation in federal prison. She's been surprisingly helpful in ongoing investigations, Agent Rivers reported. Emma continues providing information about other criminal networks targeting military families, probably because cooperation is her only source of power or purpose in prison. Has she expressed any remorse about what she did? Agent Rivers shook his head. Not in any meaningful way. Emma seems to view her crimes as business decisions that didn't work out as planned. She's more concerned about the conditions of her imprisonment than the impact of her actions on victims' families. I wasn't surprised by Emma's continued lack of empathy, but hearing about it still bothered me. The sister I'd grown up with had been replaced by someone so fundamentally different that it felt like Emma herself had died years ago, leaving behind a stranger wearing her appearance. There is one thing she asked me to tell you, Agent Rivers continued. Emma said she wants you to know that Dad really did love you, and that his favoritism toward her was something she deliberately encouraged and manipulated. She claims telling you this isn't about seeking forgiveness, but about ensuring you understand the truth about your father's feelings. I considered Emma's message carefully. Even in prison, she was trying to manipulate emotions and control narratives. But regardless of her motives, the information aligned with evidence we'd discovered about how she'd systematically worked to damage Dad's relationship with me while strengthening her own access to his resources. I appreciate you telling me, but Emma's opinion about Dad's feelings doesn't matter anymore, I told Agent Rivers. I've learned to understand Dad's love through his actions rather than through Emma's interpretations or manipulations. The Foundation's work had taught me that healing from family betrayal required focusing on positive action rather than analyzing the psychology of the betrayer. Dad's love was evident in the emergency contact card, the business card he'd clutched while dying, and the voicemail where he'd acknowledged his parenting mistakes and expressed affection for both his children. That evening, I visited Dad's grave for the second anniversary of his death. The headstone now included an inscription, "Loving Father and Veteran." His sacrifice protects other families. Below his military service information, we'd added Harold Mitchell Memorial Foundation, honoring service by protecting those who served. Standing beside Dad's grave, I told him about the foundation's accomplishments, the families we'd helped, and the legislation we'd influenced to protect military veterans from financial exploitation. I described the community of advocates and supporters who'd rallied around his memory to create positive change. Dad, I finally understand what you were trying to teach me about independence and self-reliance. I said aloud, feeling slightly awkward, but needing to express these thoughts. You weren't withholding love. You were preparing me to be strong enough to handle situations like this one. Emma needed constant rescue and validation, which made her vulnerable to criminal manipulation. But you taught me to think critically and stand on my own, which gave me the strength to seek justice and help other families. A light breeze rustled the oak tree planted near Dad's headstone, and I chose to interpret it as approval of the foundation's work and the positive changes that had emerged from our family's tragedy. As I prepared to leave the cemetery, my phone buzzed with a text message from Detective Martinez. Another family contacted us after seeing your interview on the local news. Possible exploitation case involving Army veteran and his grandson. Can you meet with them tomorrow? I smiled, knowing that Dad would be proud of how his death had ultimately protected other military families from similar betrayal. Emma's evil had been transformed into a force for good, and Dad's sacrifice continued to serve his country and his fellow veterans even after his death. Walking back to my car, I realized that healing from family destruction didn't mean forgetting the pain or pretending the betrayal hadn't happened. Instead, it meant channeling that pain into meaningful action that prevented other families from experiencing similar trauma. Emma had taken our parents' lives and destroyed our family's trust. But she hadn't succeeded in destroying the love and values Dad had instilled in me. The Foundation's work was proof that good could emerge from even the most devastating betrayal, and that honoring victims meant protecting future targets rather than simply seeking revenge against perpetrators. The Harold Mitchell Memorial Foundation would continue growing and serving military families for years to come, ensuring that Dad's death had meaning, and that Emma's evil ultimately served a purpose she'd never intended, protecting the very people she'd tried to exploit. 2 years after Emma's conviction, I'd found peace, not through forgiveness or understanding, but through action and service. Dad's love had been real, his sacrifice had been meaningful, and his memory would continue protecting other families through the Foundation's work. Sometimes the greatest victory over evil isn't defeating it directly, but transforming its consequences into something beautiful and protective. Emma had intended to destroy our family for money, but instead, she created a legacy of protection and education that would serve military veterans for generations to come. That was justice. That was healing. And that was the happy ending Dad deserved, even though he didn't live to see it. Before I finish sharing this story with you, I want to ask you something that's been on my mind since the Foundation started helping families. Have you ever noticed warning signs that someone you trusted might be taking advantage of an elderly family member? Sometimes the people we're supposed to protect the most are being hurt by those closest to them, and recognizing these patterns can literally save lives. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments about how we can better protect our veterans and elderly community members from financial exploitation. If this story touched your heart or made you think about your own family relationships differently, please take a moment to like this video and share it with others who might benefit from understanding these warning signs. Your support helps us reach more people who might be in situations where this information could prevent tragedy. Thank you for listening to Dad's story and for caring about the military families and elderly Americans who've served our country with honor. They deserve our protection and respect, especially when they're most vulnerable. Please subscribe to hear more stories about justice, family healing, and the incredible strength people find when they transform their pain into purpose. May you never need the lessons this story teaches, but may you always remember that love sometimes means being strong enough to seek truth and justice even when it's painful. Take care of yourselves and the veterans in your life.